Before the samurai understood what had arrived on their shores, there was only a sound. Not the clean ring of steel. Not the snap of a bowstring. Not the heavy breath of a horse before a charge. It was shorter, uglier, and more final. A flash in the gray air. A crack like the sky splitting open. Then a man who had trained his entire life for the distance of a blade fell to something he could barely see. For centuries, Japan had known war as a contest of houses, banners, horses, bows, spears, walls, and names. A warrior carried his identity on his armor and in the stories of his bloodline. He knew what courage looked like. He knew the weight of a sword in the hand, the pull of a bow in the shoulder, the rhythm of mounted men moving across wet earth. Death was always near, but it had a shape. It had a face. It came with a shout, a charge, an arrow, or a blade. Then, in 1543, a foreign ship came to Tanegashima, a small island south of Kyushu, and brought a weapon that did not care about ancestry. The men who carried it were Portuguese traders, blown by accident and ambition into Japanese waters. Their arquebus were crude beside the elegance of Japanese steel. They were slow to reload. They were vulnerable to rain. They smelled of sulfur, oil, and burned rope. Yet one demonstration was enough to disturb the old imagination. A target could be struck from a distance with a violence that felt unnatural. Armor no longer promised the same confidence. A man without the lifetime discipline of a mounted archer could, with training and nerve, release a force that humbled men raised for war. The weapon was not beautiful. That was part of its terror. It did not ask to be admired. It asked to be copied. The lord of Tanegashima understood the meaning quickly. Japanese craftsmen examined the strange barrel, the match mechanism, and the screw used to close the breech. That screw became the first great obstacle. It was a small technical detail, almost invisible beside the smoke and thunder, but history often turns on small details. Once the smiths learned how to reproduce it, the foreign weapon stopped being foreign. It became Japanese. Within a single generation, the arquebus, known as the Tanegashima, spread through a country already burning with civil war. This was the Sengoku age, the age of the country at war. Daimyo fought for land, legitimacy, survival, and the chance to impose order on a world that had forgotten peace. Castles rose on hills. Roads filled with soldiers. Farmers were pulled into armies. Temples became fortresses. Alliances changed like weather. In that violent landscape, the gun found its purpose. It did not arrive in a peaceful society and create violence from nothing. It arrived in a society that was already searching for any advantage that could be measured, bought, trained, and repeated. Japan did not merely receive the arquebus. Japan devoured it. At first, the old warrior class could look down on the weapon. A sword had spirit. A bow required discipline from childhood. A horseman represented wealth, training, and status. A firearm seemed dirty, mechanical, and uncertain. It filled the field with smoke. It misfired. It took time. It gave ordinary men a kind of power that felt out of proportion to their rank. That was exactly why it mattered. The gun did not abolish skill. A frightened man with a wet match and shaking hands was no miracle. Powder had to be kept dry. Barrels had to be maintained. Men had to learn timing, spacing, and the quiet patience of reloading while death moved around them. But compared with the lifelong making of an elite warrior, the arquebus offered a brutal promise. It could turn organized common soldiers into a force that made nobility vulnerable. The transformation did not happen in a single battle. Bows remained important. Spears remained essential. Swords still killed in the crush and chaos after formations broke. Cavalry still mattered. The old world did not vanish overnight. For decades, Japan became a battlefield where past and future stood side by side, horsemen beside gunners, spear walls beside matchlocks, castles beside powder stores, old codes of honor beside the arithmetic of supply. Behind every gun stood a workshop. Behind every volley stood charcoal, sulfur, saltpeter, iron, wood, cord, barrels, carts, and men who understood that war was becoming more than personal bravery. It was becoming production. A daimyo who wanted guns needed smiths, powder makers, roads, storehouses, and discipline. He needed to turn ambition into an organized system. The weapon forced rulers to think like builders of machines before they had the language for modern war. This is why the story of the samurai and the gun is not simply a story about technology. It is a story about power moving downward and then being pulled upward again. The arquebus could place deadly force into the hands of a shigeru, the foot soldiers who had once seemed secondary beside mounted retainers. Yet those men became most dangerous when controlled by commanders, drilled into formations, and supplied by ambitious lords. The gun empowered the common soldier, but it also strengthened the rulers who could organize him. No one saw this more clearly than Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was not the first man in Japan to use firearms, and he was not the only one to understand their value. But he possessed a cold willingness to use whatever worked. He did not worship tradition when tradition stood in the way of victory. He saw castles as tools, alliances as temporary, religion as political force, merchants as resources, and guns as instruments of decision. In 1575, at Nagashino, that vision met one of the most feared military reputations in Japan. The Takeda clan had long been associated with powerful cavalry, disciplined advance, and the memory of commanders who could break enemies through shock and pressure. Their mounted warriors carried the confidence of an older order, not because they were foolish, but because that order had won battles. Men believe in the methods that have carried their fathers through fire. Nagashino was not a simple tale of guns destroying cavalry in one magical moment. The real story is more disciplined, and more frightening. Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu prepared their ground. They used palisades. They placed gunners behind barriers. They turned terrain, timing, and firepower into a trap. The matchlock was not treated as a heroic weapon for individual glory. It was placed inside a system. That system mattered more than the gun alone. A firearm in a single hand could terrify. Firearms in disciplined lines could change the emotional structure of a battlefield. A charge that once relied on momentum now had to cross ground broken by wood, mud, smoke, and repeated fire. Horses heard the cracks. Men saw riders fall. The old confidence did not disappear because samurai lost their courage. It broke because courage could no longer answer every problem. Imagine standing there as the rain-softened earth holds the smell of trampled grass and powder. The palisades are rough and dark. Behind them, gunners wait with matches glowing like small red insects. Officers move through the line, controlling fear with orders. Across the field, banners shift. Armor glints. Hooves begin to move. The old sound of battle rises first, men shouting, horses breathing, weapons striking against armor. Then the new sound answers. Flash. Smoke. Thunder. The first volley does not simply kill. It interrupts belief. It tells every man watching that distance has changed. Another volley follows, and another. The field becomes a place of white haze, broken bodies, and confused signals. The men behind the guns do not need to be more noble than the men before them. They need to reload. They need to hold their place. They need to trust the line. This was a new kind of bravery. The old courage surged forward, seeking contact, honor, and decision. The new courage often stood still. It waited while the enemy came. It forced trembling hands through practiced motions. Powder, ball, ramrod, match, aim. It required men to remain useful while fear moved through their bodies. In that sense, the gun did not make battle less human. It exposed a different part of the human mind. Smoke became the great curtain of the new war. It hid success and failure together. It swallowed banners. It turned familiar ground into a gray, breathing landscape. Commanders could not always see what they had done. Soldiers could not always see what threatened them. The smell of sulfur clung to hair, sleeves, and armor. The taste of powder sat on the tongue. A man could hear death working around him without knowing whose side it favored. After Nagashino, no serious commander could pretend that firearms were a passing curiosity. The lesson was not that cavalry was useless. It was not that swords were meaningless. It was not even that the gun always won. The lesson was harder. Weapons mattered most when connected to terrain, supply, training, command, and political will. Nobunaga had shown that the future belonged to those who could build the conditions under which the new weapon became reliable. The consequences spread quickly. More lords invested in guns. More workshops made them. More Ishiguro learned to fire them. Castles adapted, not only to resist attack but to store arms and control territory. Campaigns required more planning. Powder became a strategic resource. The battlefield became louder, larger, and more dependent on the hidden labor behind it. For the samurai, the change was not immediate extinction. That is too simple. Samurai continued to command, fight, govern, and define the ideals of military society. Many embraced firearms. Some became expert commanders of gun units. Others carried the sword as a symbol even while armies around them depended on shot and powder. Honor did not vanish when the arquebus arrived. It changed shape. It learned to stand behind palisades. It learned to count ammunition. But something irreversible had happened. The warrior was no longer only a man of personal combat. He was increasingly part of a managed force. The individual name still mattered, but the formation mattered more. The beautifully made blade still carried meaning, but the crude barrel could decide a campaign. The old identity survived, yet it survived inside a world that had quietly rewritten the rules beneath it. There is tragedy in that transformation. Not because the old world was gentle. It was not. Samurai warfare could be ruthless, ambitious, and cruel. But there is always tragedy when a culture discovers that the skills it treated as sacred can be outpaced by a device made in a workshop. A lifetime of training could still make a man dangerous. It could not make him immune to a ball of lead crossing the field faster than thought. There is also a warning. New weapons rarely look fully formed when they first arrive. They look awkward. They look unreliable. They offend the taste of experts. They seem beneath the dignity of established elites. Then someone learns how to manufacture them, train with them, supply them, and place them inside a system. By the time the old order understands the scale of the change, the sound of the future is already echoing across the field. Japan would later restrict firearms under the Tokugawa peace, not because guns had been insignificant, but because they had been too significant to ignore. A unified order could afford to control the instruments that had helped make unification possible. The sword became the visible soul of the samurai, but the gun remained part of the memory of how power had actually been won. The first Japanese warriors who faced guns were not cowards staring at magic. They were men standing at the edge of a new reality. Some dismissed it. Some studied it. Some died before they understood it. Others seized it and built armies around its thunder. That is the pattern of history. The future does not always arrive as a masterpiece. Sometimes it arrives wet, crude, smoky, and foreign, carried onto a small island by men who do not know what they have changed. And when the smoke clears, the battlefield belongs not to the purest tradition, nor to the newest invention alone, but to those who understand what the invention does to fear, labor, discipline, and power. The samurai did not simply face guns. They faced the terrifying discovery that courage itself could be reorganized. A man could still be brave. A sword could still be beautiful. A name could still carry weight. But after Tanegashima, and after Nagashino, thunder had entered the language of Japan. The deepest shock was not that a bullet could pierce armor. Armor had always been a negotiation with death, never a guarantee against it. The deeper shock was that war could now be rehearsed as a sequence. Men could be placed behind wood, taught a rhythm, supplied with powder, and made into a storm that returned again and again. The matchlock turned fear into procedure. It asked a soldier to survive the sound, control his breath, and perform the next motion while the world disappeared in smoke. That is why the old stories feel different after the gun arrives. The sword still speaks of the individual. The gun speaks of the line, the warehouse, the road, the workshop, the commander who can make hundreds of men act as one body. It did not erase the samurai in a single flash. It forced him to live inside a larger machine. From that moment forward, every warrior listened differently.